a Korean Mafia boss who hasn't smiled in 11 years, a broke single mother, one missed paycheck from the street, and a 4-year-old girl who sat down at a piano she'd never touched and made a room full of killers go completely silent. Nobody saw it coming. Nobody was ready for what happened next. If you're watching this right now, drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit that like button and follow so you don't miss a single part. Because what this child did in that music room didn't just change one man's life. It broke something open that was never supposed to be broken. The fog came in low off the bay that Tuesday morning, thick and gray and indifferent to everything underneath it, rolling across the hills of Pacific Heights like it owned the place. Which, in a sense, it did. The expensive houses disappeared into it. The manicured hedges, the iron gates, the security cameras mounted at precise angles along stone walls. All of it softened by the fog until the neighborhood looked almost peaceful. Almost like the kind of place where nothing ugly ever happened. Kang Tae-jun knew better. He stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of his third-floor study and watched the fog move and didn't think about peace at all. He was thinking about a man named Desmond Park, who owed him $400,000 and had been avoiding his calls for 9 days. He was thinking about the shipment delayed in the port of Long Beach that was costing him $60,000 a day in storage fees and bribes and compounding interest on patients he didn't have much of. He was thinking about the meeting scheduled for Thursday with representatives from the Tran organization out of San Jose, men who smiled too easily and listened too carefully, and whom he didn't trust even slightly. He was thinking, in other words, about the things he always thought about. Below him, the estate grounds were already alive with the morning's work. Gardeners moved along the stone paths with the practiced quiet of people who understood that noise attracted attention from the man on the third floor. 2 of his security details stood near the east gate, coffee cups in hand, speaking in low voices. A delivery truck idled at the service entrance on the north side of the property, and Tae-jun watched it for a full 30 seconds before he confirmed what he already suspected. It was the linen service, right on schedule, and the driver was the same heavy-set Filipino man who'd been coming every Tuesday for 3 years. He noticed things like this. He noticed everything. It was both his greatest asset and the thing that made genuine rest functionally impossible. He turned from the window and walked to his desk. The desk was glass-topped and clean in a way that suggested not the absence of work, but the kind of ruthless organization that processed work and eliminated its evidence immediately. One folder sat in the center. He opened it, read 3 pages without sitting down, made 2 small marks in the margins, closed it, and set it precisely back where it had been. His phone buzzed on the corner of the desk. He looked at the screen. Vivienne. He let it buzz twice more before he picked up. "You're still in the study," she said. Not a question. "Good morning to you too." "I'm downstairs. Breakfast is getting cold." Her voice carried that particular texture he'd come to recognize over the past 18 months. The warmth that was really pressure, softened just enough to maintain deniability. "Come down, Tay. Give me 20 minutes. "You said that 40 minutes ago." He didn't answer that because she was right, and because being right about small things was one of the ways she kept score, and he was tired of the scorekeeping even when he couldn't articulate exactly why. 20 minutes, he said again, and ended the call. He stood for a moment in the study's silence. The room smelled like leather and cold coffee, and faintly, very faintly, like the cedar from the bookshelves that lined the eastern wall. He'd had those shelves built when he first acquired the estate 6 years ago. He'd bought most of the books by the yard from an estate sale, selected purely for the look of their spines. He'd read perhaps a dozen of them. The rest stood in mute, decorative judgment. He walked downstairs. The kitchen was the largest room on the ground floor, not because Tae-jun cooked or had any particular relationship with food beyond fuel, but because the previous owner had been a woman who hosted elaborate dinner parties and had insisted on professional-grade everything. Tae-jun had kept it as he'd found it. He kept most of the house as he'd found it. Changing things required caring about things, and caring about things had a cost he'd learned long ago to budget carefully. Vivienne was at the island counter, one leg crossed over the other on a bar stool, her phone face up beside a cup of tea she was barely touching. She was 34 and beautiful in the way that certain women are beautiful when they have worked very hard at it and have the resources to sustain that work. Immaculate posture, dark hair cut with architectural precision, clothes that looked casual and cost more than most people's car payments. She looked up when he entered, smiled. There he is. He pulled out the stool across from her and sat. Someone had set out a plate of food, eggs, fruit, something that might have been a pastry. He looked at it without particular interest. "Did you sleep?" she asked. "Some." "You were in the study until 2. "I had things to look at." She wrapped both hands around her teacup. "You always have things to look at." This was, in its way, also a form of scorekeeping. He recognized it and ate a forkful of eggs and didn't engage. From somewhere deeper in the house came the sound of a small voice, high, clear, not yet shaped into words from this distance, more like the sound of a child in mid-thought, narrating something to herself. Then footsteps, small and quick, and then a pause. Taijun glanced toward the hallway. Vivian didn't. "The new housekeeper's daughter is here again," Vivian said, the same tone she used to discuss things like delayed dry cleaning or a gardener who'd trimmed the wrong hedge. Informational, slightly inconvenienced. "Her name is Marisol," Taejun said. "I know her name." "Then use it." A small silence opened between them. Vivian took a sip of her tea and looked at her phone. Marisol Reyes had been working at the Kong estate for 8 weeks, and she was still learning where everything was, not the physical layout. She'd memorized that inside the first week, because she was the kind of person who oriented herself through space deliberately, who needed to know where the exits were and which hallways connected to which rooms, and how long it took to get from the third-floor linen storage to the West Wing guest suite when you were carrying a full laundry basket and the service elevator was down. She'd had to develop that habit in a different life, in a different city, for reasons she didn't think about anymore if she could help it. She knew the layout of the house. What she was still learning was its rhythms, the unspoken protocols. Which members of the household staff spoke to which other members and in what order? Which rooms she was expected to enter without announcement and which required a specific knock. When Mr. Kang's closed study door meant do not approach under any circumstances and when it meant only approach if it's essential. She'd gotten most of it down. She was good at reading rooms. She'd had to be. What she hadn't planned for, hadn't fully accounted for in her calculations when she took this job, was Nova. Her daughter was 4 years old and had never in her short life successfully stayed in any designated area for longer than approximately 11 minutes. Marisol had known this about Nova since the girl was 18 months old and had somehow, impossibly, gotten out of a pack-and-play that was supposed to be escape-proof and was found sitting calmly in the middle of the kitchen floor eating a package of crackers she'd retrieved from a cabinet. Nova didn't escape because she was defiant. She escaped because she was curious, and the world kept presenting things worth investigating, and she didn't yet have enough language to explain this to people who kept trying to contain her. This morning, Marisol had set Nova up in the small break room near the service entrance with a coloring book, 3 packets of crayons, a juice box, and explicit instructions not to move. She'd looked at Nova with the full weight of maternal seriousness. Nova had looked back at her with enormous dark eyes and nodded with what appeared to be genuine comprehension and agreement. 20 minutes later, Nova was gone. Marisol found the coloring book open to a half-finished elephant. The crayons were arranged in a neat row by color. Nova did this sometimes, organized things with a kind of instinctive precision that seemed at odds with her general chaos. And the juice box was empty. The break room door was slightly ajar. Marisol pressed the heel of her hand against her forehead, breathed once, and went looking. She checked the east corridor first, then the service hallway, then, because Nova had shown dangerous interest in it twice already, the door that led to the garage. Locked. She moved fast and quiet through the house, the specific controlled urgency of a mother who is not yet panicking because panic doesn't help, but who is also very aware that in a house belonging to a man like Kang Tae-jun, a 4-year-old wandering unsupervised was not simply inconvenient. It was the kind of thing that could end a job. She turned the corner into the main corridor that connected the east wing to the house's central gallery, and she heard it. She stopped walking, stood very still. From behind the closed double doors of the music room, a room she had cleaned twice and entered approximately 6 times, and had always found empty and essentially decorative in the way that many rooms in this house were essentially decorative, came a sound. Piano notes. Not a song she recognized. Not a song at all, technically. More like the beginning of an idea. Single notes at first, spaced apart, exploratory. The way fingers move when they're testing something out, figuring out what happens when you press this key, and this one, and then this one over here. Then the notes started finding each other. started building something. Marisol walked to the doors and opened them very slowly. The music room was large and high-ceilinged, the walls paneled in pale wood, the light coming in through tall windows on the south side that looked out onto the garden. At the far end of the room, against the wall, stood the Steinway, a 9-foot concert grand that she'd been told by one of the other staff members had cost somewhere in the vicinity of $200,000 and was played by no one, as far as anyone knew. Nova was sitting on the bench. She was small enough that her feet didn't reach the floor. They swung slightly in the empty air below the keys. She was wearing her purple sneakers with the Velcro straps and her favorite shirt with the cartoon octopus on it, and she was looking at the keys with the particular expression she got when she was working something out. Forehead slightly furrowed, lower lip pushed forward in concentration. She played 3 more notes in a row. Listened. Played them again, but changed the third one. Listened again. Marisol watched her daughter and felt something press against the inside of her chest that didn't have a clean name. She should go in. She should take Nova's hand gently but firmly and say, "We don't touch things that aren't ours, sweet girl. We talked about this." And she should carry her back to the break room and figure out how to contain her better and hope to everything that no one had heard. She didn't move. Nova played 4 notes now, and they landed together like something inevitable, like they'd always been in that order and she'd simply found them. And then she played them again and added 1 more at the end, and the room, this expensive, echoing, empty room, held the sound for a moment before releasing it. Marisol realized she was holding her breath. She also realized, in the same moment, that she was not alone in the doorway. She turned her head. Kang Tai-jun was standing 3 feet to her left. She had not heard him approach. She didn't know how long he'd been there. His face, which she had studied carefully over 8 weeks because you studied the face of the man who controlled your livelihood, you read it the way you read weather, was doing something she hadn't seen it do before. It was doing nothing. Not the controlled neutrality he wore as a default. The careful blankness of a man who had learned that expression was information, and information was leverage. This was different. This was the absence of performance. He was just looking at the child at the piano, and whatever he was feeling was moving across his face without his permission, and he either didn't know it or had decided for this one moment not to stop it. Marisol's heart was doing something complicated in her chest. She opened her mouth. He raised one hand barely, just a slight lift of 2 fingers, without looking at her. She closed her mouth. Nova played the melody again, longer this time. She'd added a beginning to it now, a few notes that set up the sequence she'd found, and then the sequence itself, and then something after it that descended, that brought it down to a close. It was perhaps 45 seconds of music. It was imperfect in the way that something made entirely without instruction is always imperfect. The rhythm was slightly unsteady. A couple of the note choices were unexpected in ways that weren't entirely intentional. But it had a shape. It had a logic. It had, underneath all of it, a feeling. Though Marisol could not have said what that feeling was exactly, except that it pressed on something. When the last note faded, Nova sat very still for a moment, listening to the room. Then she turned around on the bench. She saw Marisol first. "Mama," she said, "did you hear?" "I heard, baby." Then Nova noticed Tai-jun. She looked at him with the completely unfiltered assessment of a 4-year-old who has not yet learned that powerful men are supposed to be frightening, who doesn't know or care about his reputation or his money or the 11 different ways the people in his professional world are afraid of him. "Do you like it?" she asked him. A beat, 2 beats. Tai-jun crouched down until he was closer to her eye level. It was a strange thing to watch. A large man in expensive clothes folding himself down toward a child with a cartoon octopus on her shirt. "I liked it," he said. "I made it myself," Nova told him, with the specific confidence of a person reporting an established fact. "I know," he said. "I could tell." Xiang. Later, Marisol would remember that conversation as the dividing line, the thing that came before it and the things that came after it. She wouldn't be able to articulate exactly why for a long time. It wasn't that anything dramatic happened in the immediate aftermath. Tai-jun stood back up, told her quietly that she could bring Nova to the music room during her shift if she needed a place to keep her occupied, and walked away down the corridor without another word. Marisol stood in the doorway of the music room and watched him go and felt the specific vertigo of something having shifted that she couldn't yet identify. Behind her, Nova had turned back to the piano. She was already finding new notes. Over the following 3 weeks, Marisol established a routine. She would set Nova up at the piano in the late morning while she worked the rooms on the east side of the house, close enough to check on her every 15 minutes, far enough to get actual work done. Nova accepted this arrangement with enthusiasm. The piano had become, in the economy of her 4-year-old priorities, the most important object in the known world. She played it every day. She played it the way some children play with blocks or dolls. Not as performance, not for an audience, but as pure investigation. She was building something, though she couldn't have explained what. She was listening to what the instrument told her and making adjustments and listening again. The other household staff noticed. Yoonji, the head housekeeper, mentioned it to Marisol carefully, feeling out whether it was a problem. Marisol told her that Mr. Kang had given permission. Yoonji's eyebrows moved slightly, and she went back to her work and didn't mention it again. Taejun passed by the music room twice in those 3 weeks, at times when Marisol was certain were not accidental. He didn't enter. He paused in the corridor, audibly from where Marisol stood in the adjacent room, and then he moved on. She filed this away without deciding what to do with it. What she was less prepared to file away was Vivienne. Vivienne Laurent had not, as far as Marisol could determine, said a single thing directly to her about Nova or the piano or any of it. What she had done was make certain adjustments to the household schedule that appeared administrative on their surface. Marisol's Tuesday duties had been redistributed to add the West Wing on top of her existing East Wing responsibilities. Her Thursday mornings, which had been the easier shift she used to handle the longer tasks without rushing, were now compressed by an added requirement to have the formal dining room set for a possible afternoon meeting. The piano room, by a rescheduling Vivienne had delivered to Yoonji verbally, was now on the cleaning list for 10 a.m., which happened to be exactly when Nova was typically most settled at the keys. None of it was explicit. All of it was effective. Marisol worked the new schedule and said nothing. She'd had worse. She'd had a husband who thought the most elegant cruelties were the ones that could be explained away, and she'd learned to recognize that particular architecture. She recognized it now and stayed quiet and made it work because she had no alternative that didn't involve her daughter sleeping somewhere without a roof. She was behind on her rent in her apartment across the city. She had approximately $200 in savings. She had a contact at a childcare program that Nova was on the wait list for, had been on the wait list for 9 months. And until that came through, she was dependent on bringing Nova to the estate or paying for childcare she couldn't afford. The job paid well by the standards of this kind of work. She had found it through a service that placed domestic staff in high-end households and had passed 3 background checks and 2 in-person interviews, and had signed a non-disclosure agreement that she'd had a paralegal friend read through before she'd put her name on it. She needed this job. She needed it with the focused desperation of a woman who understood exactly what the alternative looked like, because she'd been close enough to it to see the details clearly. So she worked the news schedule, and she watched Vivienne with the careful peripheral attention of someone who has learned that the threat you're not looking at directly is usually the one that matters, and she made sure Nova was quiet and contained and gave no one a reason to reconsider the permission that had been granted. She almost managed it. The dinner was announced on a Wednesday. Yoonji called a brief meeting of the full household staff Thursday morning and laid out the parameters with the clipped efficiency of someone who'd done this many times. 40 guests. Friday evening, beginning at 7. The formal dining room and the adjacent reception hall would both be used. A catering team would handle food and service, but the household staff were responsible for setup, room preparation, and throughout the evening, coordination. Dress standards were formal. Schedule adjustments were already posted in the staff room. Marisol looked at the posted schedule and understood immediately that Friday would require her to work through her daughter's normal evening. She spent Thursday night trying to arrange for her neighbor Danica, an older Trinidadian woman who worked nights and occasionally watched Nova in exchange for Marisol covering her mail and small household tasks, to take Nova for the night. Danica said yes, but with the hesitation of someone who had plans, and Marisol spent 20 minutes reassuring her and feeling the specific guilt of a single mother who is always negotiating the care of her child with people who are doing her a favor and know it. It was arranged. Nova would go to Danica's. Friday came. At 4:30 p.m., 2 hours before the dinner was scheduled to begin, Marisol was in the formal dining room arranging name cards under Yoonji's direction when her phone buzzed in her apron pocket. She checked it during a 5-minute break in a hallway. It was a text from Danica. "I'm so sorry, honey. My sister had a fall. I have to go to the hospital. I can't take Nova tonight. I'm sorry. Marisol stood in the hallway and read the text twice. Then she read it a third time. She did the calculation she'd done 100 times in the past year with the practice speed of someone who'd made mental arithmetic into a survival skill. There was no one else. She'd already tapped Danica and 2 other contacts in the past month, and there was a limit to how many times you could ask before people started being unavailable. She couldn't take Nova to Danica's alone. She couldn't leave her in the apartment. Nova was 4, which was approximately 18 years younger than the minimum age for a child to be left alone anywhere. There was no emergency childcare she could afford on 4 hours' notice that wouldn't cost more than she was making for this shift. Nova was coming to the estate. Marisol put her phone back in her pocket and went back to the dining room and finished the name cards and thought, with the controlled clarity of someone who had learned not to let catastrophizing take the wheel, about how to make this work. She'd keep Nova in the break room. She'd explain to Yoon-ji. She'd make sure Nova stayed out of sight. It wasn't ideal. It was, however, the only option that existed, and she'd made peace with options like this before. What she did not account for, because there was no way she could have, was Vivian. Nova arrived at the estate at 5 p.m. in her good dress, green velvet, slightly too big, bought from a resale shop 3 months ago because it was the nicest thing available and Nova loved the color. She was also wearing her purple sneakers because the good shoes pinched, and Marisol had decided that battle was not worth fighting today. Marisol settled her in the break room with the coloring book and the crayons and a new addition. A small battery-powered keyboard Marisol had found at a thrift store 2 weeks ago, specifically for Nova to use at home. She plugged in the headphones, set Nova up with it, and explained carefully, clearly, with the full gravity of the situation, that tonight was a very important night and Nova needed to stay in this room and be completely quiet. Nova, headphones around her neck, looked at her with those enormous eyes. Okay, Mama. I mean it, Nova Marie. I know, Mama. Marisol kissed the top of her head and went back to work. At 6 p.m., Vivienne Laurent walked into the break room. Marisol didn't see it happen. She was on the second floor when Yoon-ji found her with an expression that had been specifically shaped not to show alarm, which was itself alarming. Ms. Laurent would like to speak with you, downstairs. Marisol followed her. Vivienne was in the hallway outside the break room. The door was open behind her. Inside, Nova sat at her keyboard, headphones on, playing something to herself with focused absorption. Vivienne turned when Marisol approached, and her expression was the expression of a woman who has found exactly what she was looking for and is performing surprise about it. I didn't realize your daughter was here, Vivienne said. I apologize. My childcare arrangement fell through this afternoon. I should have notified you. It won't happen again. No, Vivienne said. It won't. The tone was pleasant. The words were not. I'll find a solution for the evening, Marisol said. She'll stay out of sight completely. Actually, Vivienne said, I have another idea. She said it the way people say things when the idea has already been decided and the sentence is a formality. The musicians canceled this afternoon. Both of them. Food poisoning, apparently. Mr. Kang's guests will be expecting entertainment. Her eyes moved briefly to the open break room door, to the back of Nova's small head in the oversized headphones. Your daughter is quite talented, from what I understand. Marisol felt something go very still in her chest. She's 4 years old, Marisol said. Children that age perform all the time. It's charming. She's not trained. She plays by ear. She's never... It would resolve the entertainment problem, Vivienne said, and it would mean your daughter is accounted for the evening, supervised, visible. A small smile. Rather than left in a back room alone while you work. The last sentence was dressed up as consideration. It was not consideration. Marisol understood, with the same clarity she'd understood everything else this woman had arranged in the past several weeks, exactly what was being offered. This was not an opportunity. This was a construction. 40 guests, people whose names she'd seen on those place cards, people with power and money and the specific impatience of those who had both, would watch a housekeeper's child fumble through untrained playing, and everyone in the room would understand the message embedded in it. This was entertainment of a different kind. A lesson delivered publicly about hierarchy and belonging and who stood where. She looked at Vivienne. Vivienne looked back at her with steady, pleasant eyes. I'll ask Nova, Marisol said. She's 4, Vivienne said, the smile widening slightly. She'll say yes. Nova said yes. She said it with the immediate, uncomplicated enthusiasm of a child who has been told she gets to play the big piano in front of people and who has not yet developed the circuitry for anticipating humiliation because no one has ever tried to humiliate her before. She said it and then went back to her keyboard for another 20 minutes of practice before Marisol gently took the headphones from her and smoothed her hair and tried to keep her own hand steady. By 7:15, the guests were arriving. Marisol watched from the second-floor landing as they filtered in below. She had been right about the place cards. These were not people who announced themselves loudly. They arrived in quiet, expensive ways, greeted by Vivian with practiced warmth, directed toward the reception hall where the bar had been set up. Some of the men she recognized by type, not by name, the stillness, the way they occupied space, the absence of any posturing. Men who'd been powerful long enough that it had become invisible to them, the way weight becomes invisible to water. She saw Tae-jun below, standing near the entrance to the reception hall in a dark suit, watching his guests arrive with that face, the controlled, unreadable face, and for a moment he looked up toward the landing. His eyes found her. She looked away first. At 8 p.m., Vivienne made the announcement. She did it beautifully. That was the thing Marisol would remember, how beautifully it was done. Vivienne stood at the entrance to the music room with a champagne flute in one hand and her voice perfectly modulated, amused, light. Our musical guests couldn't be with us this evening, she told the assembled room, but we have something perhaps more charming. One of our household staff has a daughter, 4 years old, can you imagine, who apparently has quite a little gift for the piano. We thought we'd give her the chance to share it. Murmurs, smiles. The specific indulgent warmth of powerful people being asked to be charmed by something small. Marisol stood at the back of the room. Nova stood beside her, hand in her hand, looking at the Steinway across the room with pure focus. You don't have to do this, Marisol said quietly. Nova looked up at her. I want to. She walked across the room to the piano bench with the specific gravity of a child who is not performing bravery, but simply doesn't know yet to be afraid. She climbed up onto the bench. Her feet swung above the floor. She looked at the keys. The room watched with the polite, expectant attention of people who are prepared to be mildly entertained and then move on. Marisol pressed her thumbnail into her palm and breathed. Nova put her hands on the keys, and the room, within 4 measures, went completely silent. It wasn't the silence of people being polite. It wasn't the silence of people waiting for a child to finish. It was the silence that happens when something unexpected enters a room and every nervous system in the space registers it before the brain has time to categorize it. The kind of silence that falls when something true is spoken in a room full of people who haven't heard the truth in a long time. Nova played. She played the melody she'd been building for 3 weeks, refined now, thickened. The uncertainties mostly resolved through repetition until what remained was only what belonged. She played it with her small hands, moving across keys that were almost too wide for them, and the sound that came out of that $200,000 instrument was something that the instrument had been waiting a long time to produce. Marisol felt the tears before she knew they were coming. She pressed her lips together and breathed through her nose and watched her daughter play and did not let them fall. Across the room she saw Vivian's expression. The pleasant smile was still there, but it had stopped moving, and then slowly, beneath the stillness and the sound and the 40 people who had gone motionless around the room, Marisol saw something else. At the back wall, slightly apart from the rest of the guests, Kang Tae-jun stood with his arms at his sides. He was not looking at Nova. He was looking at Vivian. The final note rang out and faded, and the room held the silence for 1 breath, 2 breaths, 3. And then the applause broke, genuine and startled, the applause of people who had not expected to feel something and felt it anyway. And through it all, Marisol watched Tae-jun's face and saw there something she did not entirely understand. Calculation. But beneath the calculation, older and quieter, recognition. He had seen something, and across the room, Vivian saw him seeing it. Her smile returned, warmer now, deliberate. She raised her champagne glass in a small, private toast toward Marisol. Just barely. Just enough. Marisol understood it exactly. She understood that tonight had not gone the way it was supposed to go. She understood that a 4-year-old in purple sneakers had walked into a room full of the world's most dangerous people and done the last thing anyone expected. She also understood that Vivian Laurent had not yet decided she was finished. and that Tae-jun, who had spent the last 45 minutes watching his fiancée very carefully, had in this moment stepped across some internal threshold that he had not stepped across before. The applause was still going. Nova turned around on the bench and found her mother's face in the crowd. She smiled, and Marisol smiled back, and it was the realest thing in the room. And somewhere in the back of that music-filled space, a man who had taught himself over decades not to feel things he couldn't control felt something he had no protocol for. He didn't look away from Vivian, but his hands, at his sides, had closed into fists. Quote. Later, after the applause, after the dinner, after the guests had filtered out with their expensive quietness and their careful goodbyes, Marisol carried a sleeping Nova through the corridor toward the service exit. She was almost to the door when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned. Tae-jun stood in the corridor. He looked at the sleeping child in her arms, then at Marisol. "Did she eat?" he asked. Marisol blinked. Yes, before the dinner." He nodded. Then, without any of the framing she would have expected, "The announcement tonight, did you agree to it?" The question sat in the air between them. Marisol considered her answer for exactly as long as she could afford to consider it, which was less than 3 seconds. "I was presented with an option," she said. He looked at her. He had very dark eyes and the ability to hold eye contact without it feeling like aggression, which was rarer than it should have been. "That's not what I asked." She held Nova a little tighter. The child shifted in her sleep but didn't wake. "No," Marisol said. "I didn't agree to it." Tae-jun said nothing for a moment. Then, "Go home. Get her to bed." He turned and walked back down the corridor. Marisol stood very still for a moment in the low light with her daughter's weight against her chest, and something dangerous happening in her understanding of what she'd walked into when she took this job 8 weeks ago. She went home. She put Nova to bed. She sat at her own kitchen table with a glass of water and her phone in her hand, looking at nothing for a long time. And 3 miles away, in the estate on the hill, Vivienne Laurent closed the bedroom door and said, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, "Tonight went well, don't you think?" Kang Tae-jun looked at her for a long moment. "Did it?" he said. It wasn't a question. And Vivienne, who had spent 18 months reading this man's silences and translating them to her advantage, felt for the first time a particular chill at the back of her neck that she didn't want to name. She smiled wider and said nothing. But she felt it. But the morning after the dinner, Tae-jun woke at 5 a.m. and lay in the dark for 11 minutes without moving. This was not unusual. He often woke before the alarm, before the light, before the house made any sound at all. He'd developed the habit years ago when sleeping through something had cost him in ways he still carried. Now his body refused to let him fully under. He'd surface at odd hours with his heart already at a working rate and his mind already running the calculations it had been running in the background the whole time he was supposedly unconscious. This morning the calculation was simple. He replayed the dinner. Not Nova's playing, though that kept surfacing in a way that had nothing to do with analysis, just the sound of it returning without invitation. He replayed the sequence of events around it. The announcement. Vivian's voice, calibrated and bright. The way she'd positioned it. Charming, she'd said, as if the child were a curiosity. The specific timing of it, filling the entertainment slot left by the canceled musicians. 40 guests seated with their expectations and their glasses and their careful social agreements all tuned to receive exactly the performance Vivian had designed. He replayed Marisol's face when the announcement was made. She'd been standing at the back of the room and she had not known it was coming, or if she hadn't chosen it, and the difference between those two things was not a small difference. He was a man who had spent 20 years reading the distinction between compliance and choice, between what someone did because they wanted to and what they did because the other options were worse. He read it in boardrooms and in back rooms and across tables where agreements were made that couldn't be put in writing. He was rarely wrong about it. He hadn't been wrong about it last night. He lay in the dark and let the calculation finish itself and then got up. Vivian was still asleep. He didn't look at her as he moved through the room tab. He was at his desk by 5:20 with coffee he'd made himself. Black, no ceremony, and his phone face down on the glass surface. He turned it over. 14 messages from the previous evening, none of them urgent enough to have warranted waking him. He worked through them in order, 2 from his operations manager in Los Angeles, 1 from his attorney, several from associates in varying time zones with varying requests, One from his financial officer with a summary of the week's numbers that he read twice and set aside. The last message was from a number he didn't recognize. He almost skipped it. He almost moved on to the next thing on the morning's agenda, which was a call at 6 a.m. with a man in Seoul who was never available any other time due to the time difference, and the paranoia that had served him well enough to keep him alive for 60 years in a business that ate people who weren't careful. He opened the message. Your fiancé made a phone call this afternoon to Reyes's previous employer. Thought you should know what kind of call it was. No name. The number, when he looked it up internally, was a prepaid phone purchased in cash. Someone inside the household, or close enough to it to know the personnel. He set the phone down. Picked it up again. Set it down. The 6 a.m. call happened on schedule. He handled it with the part of his brain that ran on autopilot, the professional surface that could conduct business while the deeper machinery was doing something else entirely. He made 3 decisions, gave 2 instructions, and ended the call in 32 minutes. Then he sat for a moment and thought about what someone with access to this household would know about Marisol Reyes' previous employer and why they'd decided he needed to know about a phone call. He picked up his phone and sent 2 words to a number he knew well. Find out. Marisol arrived at the estate at 8 a.m. She'd left Nova with Danica, who had returned from the hospital at midnight and felt badly enough about Friday to insist on taking the girl for the day. Marisol had accepted without argument, which told her something about her own state of mind. She was not a woman who accepted favors easily. She took the bus across the city and then walked the last 4 blocks up the hill because the walk gave her time. Time to work out what she was going to say or not say, how she was going to carry herself, what posture she was going to bring into a house where she had spent the night understanding that she was not simply an employee navigating a difficult situation, but a piece in a game whose rules she hadn't been shown. She'd been a piece in someone else's game before. She remembered how that ended. The thing she kept landing on, in the 4 blocks up the hill, was the money. $200 in savings, 9 months on a childcare wait list, rent due in 11 days. She did the arithmetic she always did, the flat, merciless kind, and arrived at the same place she always arrived. She needed this job, not abstractly, not as a preference. She needed it the way you need the thing standing between you and the specific version of disaster you can see clearly from where you're standing. She went in through the service entrance, changed into her uniform, started her morning duties. She was in the East Wing guest bathroom on her hands and knees with a cleaning brush when she heard heels on the hallway floor and knew without looking up who it was. Marisol. She sat back on her heels and looked up. Vivian stood in the doorway in cream-colored trousers and a silk blouse, a coffee cup in one hand, her hair perfect at 8:30 in the morning. Miss Laurent, last night was lovely, don't you think? Vivian said. The guests were charmed. Several of them mentioned Nova specifically. She smiled. You must be proud. Yes, Marisol said. I hope it wasn't too much for her, performing like that. She was fine. Good. Vivian sipped her coffee. I've been thinking, given how well it went, I might suggest to Tay that we formalize something, perhaps a small monthly stipend, in addition to your salary, to contribute to Nova's education. Nothing substantial, but it's the least we can do, given her talent. Marisol looked at her. She looked at her for a moment longer than was perhaps professionally advisable, long enough that Vivian's smile held itself with slightly more effort. That's very generous, Marisol said. Her voice was level. She'd worked at keeping it level. We take care of our people, Vivian said. After she left, Marisol turned back to the bathroom and pressed the cleaning brush against the tile floor and breathed through her nose, slow and deliberate, until the thing in her chest that wanted to come out found nowhere to go and settled back down. Our people. She worked for the next 4 hours without stopping. It was Yoonji who told her about the call. She didn't intend to, or at least Marisol read it as unintentional. Yoonji was not a woman who trafficked in household gossip out of pleasure, and the way she mentioned it, sideways during a logistics conversation about the supply order, had the texture of something she'd been deciding whether to say. The Connolly family, Yoonji said, naming Marisol's previous employer without meeting her eyes, checking a clipboard instead. Called this morning. They were asking about you. Marisol stopped. They were asking about you, Yoonji repeated, and about the circumstances of your departure. What did you tell them? That you were an excellent employee, which is true. Who asked you to call them? Yoonji looked at her clipboard. Yoonji. The call came in on a personal line, Yoonji said carefully, which told Marisol everything. That the call had not gone through the household management system, not through the official channels that would have logged it and created a record, but had been made directly by someone who didn't want a record. Marisol thought about the Connolly family. She thought about the departure. She thought about what the Connollys would say if someone asked them, and about the specific shape of her departure. So, not fired, technically, but the option between resigning and making a fight she couldn't afford to have. She thought about what that conversation would produce if it were extracted and placed in the right ears. She nodded slowly. "Thank you," she said. "I wanted you to know," Yoonji said, which was as close as she was going to get to saying what she meant. "What?" Taejun came home at 3 p.m. He came home earlier than usual and without announcement, which was itself unusual. His movements were typically communicated to the household staff by his assistant at least an hour in advance, not for his benefit but for theirs. He arrived without notice, walked directly past the main hall and through the east corridor, and came to the kitchen where Marisol was working a detailed task involving the organized inventory of the pantry, which was the kind of absorbing, low-stakes work that she used today to keep herself functioning. She heard him before she saw him. He came through the kitchen entrance and stopped when he saw her. She looked up from the shelf she was cataloging. "Where is she today?" he asked. "With my neighbor. She's fine." He nodded. He went to the counter and poured himself water from the pitcher. Didn't use the filtered tap the way Vivian always insisted. Just took the pitcher and poured it into a glass and drank half of it standing up. Then he set the glass down and looked at the pantry shelf she was working on. "You knew," he said, "about the call to the Connollys." She held very still. "I found out this morning." "Tell me about them." "That's not—" "Tell me." His voice was the same as it always was. Not raised, not aggressive, but it carried the specific weight of a man accustomed to having his questions answered, and not from a place of cruelty, just from a place of complete certainty that the question would be answered. Marisol looked at the shelf, then at him. "I worked for the Connolly family for 14 months, she said. "I left in January. The departure was, they said I took something. Something went missing from the house, and Mrs. Connolly said she saw me near the room where it was kept." "Did you take it?" "No." "Do they believe that?" "Mr. Connolly did. Mrs. Connolly decided not to." She paused. "I didn't fight it. I couldn't afford to fight it. I took a reference from Mr. Connolly and I left." Taejun looked at her for a long moment. Not with judgment. She would have been able to read judgment. She was good at reading it. But with something more like inventory, like he was placing information in sequence. "Who recommended this position to you?" "The placement service, Kim Domestic Staffing." "Who at the service?" "A woman named Elena Park." He nodded once, as if confirming something. "You're not going to lose this job," he said. "Over the Connollys or anything else connected to that call." She looked at him. "I'm not telling you that to be kind," he said. "I'm telling you because someone made a move that was meant to produce a specific result, and I want you to know it won't produce that result." She thought about the words carefully, the way she thought about everything from the position of someone who'd learned that what people said and what they meant existed in a relationship that required verification. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. He picked up his water glass and finished it. "Because you asked an honest question last night," he said, "when most people in your position would have answered the one that was easier." He set the glass in the sink. "That's worth something." He left the kitchen. Marisol stood in the pantry doorway for a moment, then turned back to the shelf she'd been cataloging and continued working, except that now her hands were not entirely steady, and she allowed them to be unsteady for approximately 30 seconds before they settled. Vivian found out he'd come home early. She found out through the same informal network that told her most things about the household, a specific permeability in the staff's loyalty that she'd cultivated carefully over 18 months. Small favors, remembered details, the particular attention that made people feel seen. She found out he'd come home at 3 and gone to the kitchen, and that the kitchen had been occupied by Marisol. She didn't react. That was one of her genuine disciplines. The non-reaction. She'd built it as a young woman growing up in a household where reactions were used against you, and had refined it over the years into something almost physiological, an override she could engage in real time. She went to the east sitting room and made 2 phone calls, short ones. Then she sat for a moment with her phone in her lap and thought. The dinner had not produced what she'd wanted. She'd understood that clearly in the moment, watching Taejun's face while the room applauded a housekeeper's 4-year-old daughter, watching him watching her. She knew his tells better than he thought she did, which was itself a kind of advantage she'd worked to maintain carefully. She'd seen the shift, the small recalibration that happened behind his eyes when he decided something. She'd made a mistake, not in the substance of what she'd done, the elimination of a problem she'd correctly identified, but in the method. She'd miscalculated the optics. She'd underestimated the child's actual ability. She'd expected embarrassment and produced something closer to revelation, and that reversal had happened in front of 40 people whose reading of the situation she couldn't control or correct after the fact. The Connolly call had been a correction. Necessary, clean, deniable. She'd gone through a channel that couldn't be traced directly to her without multiple steps of inference, and she'd been careful. But he'd found out anyway. That was the thing about Taejun that had taken her longer than it should have to fully internalize. He found out. Not everything, but the things that mattered to him, and his sense of what mattered shifted in ways she couldn't always predict. It was one of the qualities that had attracted her to him in the first place, and was now, occasionally, the quality she found most inconvenient. She sat with the phone in her lap and let herself think, without the non-reaction, without the careful surface, about what she actually wanted and what was in the way of it. What she wanted was the estate, the position, the marriage that formalized what she'd spent 18 months constructing. Not for love, she didn't use that word for this or most things, but for the architecture of it, the life that came with his name. She'd worked for it with the specific focus of someone who had grown up without it, and had decided early that she would not grow up without it and keep it that way. What was in the way was a housekeeper's daughter who played the piano like she was telling the truth. She thought about this for a while. Then she made a third call. The following Tuesday, Marisol arrived to find her schedule had been revised again. This time it wasn't the hours or the room assignments. This time someone, and the revision had come through official channels, through Yoonji, attributed to a general household restructuring, had changed her working days. Tuesday and Wednesday were now her days off. She would work Thursday through Monday instead. She read the revised schedule standing in the staff room. Thursday through Monday. Nova's music time at the estate had been Thursday mornings. Taejun was at the estate on weekday mornings. He was in Seoul Thursday through Monday of the following week. A trip scheduled for the past month, in the calendar, unavoidable. She stood with the schedule in her hand and understood the construction of it completely, the way you understand a lock once someone's shown you where the tumblers are. When she came back on Thursday, Taejun would be gone, and whatever permission had been extended, for Nova, for the music room, for the specific buffer that his presence in the house provided, would be extended by no one. She folded the schedule and put it in her pocket. She went to find Yoonji. "The revision," she said when she found her. "Did it come from Ms. Laurent?" Yoonji was quiet for a moment. The restructuring was logged through General Household Administration. Yoonji. The woman looked at the clipboard again. Then she looked at Marisol with the expression of someone who is being as honest as she can afford to be. "It came through the right channels. That's what I can tell you." "Okay," Marisol said. She went to the East Wing and did her work. At 11 a.m., she passed the music room. The door was open. The Steinway was there, lid down, in the particular silence of a room that doesn't know it's waiting. She kept walking. At 4:30 p.m., she was finishing the corridor near the West Wing entrance when she heard the footsteps and looked up, and Taejun was coming toward her with his jacket off and his sleeves rolled to the elbow, and the expression of a man who has been managing something unpleasant and has reached the end of his patience with the management. He stopped when he reached her. "I've been in Desmond Park's building for 6 hours," he said. Not to her specifically. It came out like a decompression. Like he'd run out of the part of himself that kept things in. "The man owes me $400,000, and he spent the afternoon explaining to me why that's theoretically my problem." She looked at him. He looked at her. Something about the situation. His sleeves rolled up, the exhaustion visible in the set of his jaw, the 6 hours she could see on him, produced in her a slight loosening of the careful professional distance she maintained, and she said, "Did he pay?" "He will," said with a flatness that contained its own punctuation. She almost smiled, stopped herself. "Your schedule was changed," he said, the shift immediate. "Yes. I saw the log. I know you leave Thursday." "Yes." He looked at her. Nova can use the music room whenever she's here. That's not something that changes because of a schedule revision. I understand. Do you understand that I mean it won't change? The directness of it landed on her differently than she expected. She was used to men who qualified things, who said almost but didn't say always, who said probably and meant when it's convenient. The unqualified statement was unusual enough to need a second to process.
Yes, she said. I understand. He nodded, started to turn. Mr. Kang. He turned back. The Connolly call, she said. Did you find out who made it? He looked at her with those dark, even eyes. I'm still finding out, he said. She nodded. He went down the corridor. She watched him go and thought that still finding out was not the same as I don't know, and that a man like this one very rarely said things he didn't mean with precision. She went back to her work. Ciao.
He left on Thursday. Friday was quiet. Saturday was quieter. Marisol moved through the house on her revised schedule and performed her duties with the compact efficiency she'd perfected over years of making reduced circumstances function at full capacity. She brought Nova on Saturday morning, settled her in the music room without announcement or permission seeking because the permission had been given and she had decided to act on it like it was real until someone proved it wasn't. Nova played for 3 hours. No one said anything. Sunday evening, Marisol was at the service entrance preparing to leave when she found an envelope in the staff message box with her name on it. No return address, no household letterhead, just her name in handwriting she didn't recognize. She opened it. Inside was a single page, a printout. It took her 6 seconds to understand what she was looking at and another 4 to accept it. It was a copy of an internal communication from the Kim Domestic Staffing Agency. An email. The email was from Vivian Laurent to a woman named Park Soo-young, who was not Elena Park, not the agent who'd placed Marisol, but someone higher. The email was 8 weeks old. It predated Marisol's hire. She read it. She read it twice. The email was about placement criteria. It was written as a request. Can you identify for the available domestic position a candidate with X qualifications? And the qualifications were specific: female, with dependents, limited prior employment documentation, no family in the area, financial constraints that would discourage conflict or complaint. The email was professional in its language and unambiguous in its architecture. Vivian had not found Marisol by accident. Vivian had selected her. Marisol stood at the service entrance with the paper in her hand and the fog coming off the bay somewhere below the hill, and felt the world she'd been standing in rearrange itself into its true shape. The job that had seemed like luck, a good placement, good pay, a position she'd earned through 3 background checks and 2 interviews, had been designed from the outside. Not to employ her, to contain her, to bring in someone who needed the money enough to stay quiet and had enough vulnerability to make useful. She'd been selected for her desperation. She folded the paper, put it in her bag, went out into the evening, down the hill toward the bus stop, and thought, with a kind of cold clarity that was the hardest emotion to sustain because it required the most discipline, about what happened next. Because she was done staying quiet, and someone had just put a weapon in her hand, and they were either very brave or very... Someone had just put a weapon in her hand, and they were either very brave or very stupid. And Marisol had spent enough time around both kinds of people to know the difference mattered. She rode the bus home with the folded paper in her bag and her hands in her lap and her face doing nothing. The bus was half full. A Sunday evening crowd, tired people heading back to apartments after weekends that hadn't been long enough, a teenager with headphones, an old man with a grocery bag between his feet. Nobody looked at anybody. The city moved past the windows in its indifferent way, and Marisol looked at it and thought. The email changed the geometry of everything, not the facts. The facts were what they'd always been. Her situation, Nova's situation, the money, the job, Vivian's accumulated adjustments. But the meaning underneath the facts. There was a difference between being a woman navigating a difficult employer and being a woman who had been deliberately recruited for her navigability. The first was hard. The second was something else, something that required a different response. She got home at 8:14. Nova was asleep at Danica's. She'd pick her up in the morning. She sat at the kitchen table and opened her laptop and looked at the email again. She'd photographed it on the bus, 3 pictures from different angles, already sent to her own email address, and saved to the cloud storage she paid $3 a month for. And she read it carefully, the way she hadn't been able to on the bus, with her pulse doing what it had been doing. The language was careful, professional. Vivian had written it the way lawyers write things when they know the writing might be read by someone other than the intended recipient. Nothing explicitly stated that couldn't be explained. Nothing that said, "I want a woman I can threaten," in those words. But the architecture of the qualifications was a blueprint for exactly that. Limited prior documentation, no family in the area, financial constraints that would discourage conflict. The word discourage sat there like a stone. Marisol thought about Elena Park, the agent at Kim Domestic who'd processed her application, who'd been warm and efficient, and had called to tell her she'd gotten the position with what sounded like genuine pleasure. She thought about whether Elena knew what the request had actually been, whether she was complicit or just the mechanism through which a complicit system operated. She thought about who had sent her the envelope. Someone in the household, someone with access to communications that were not meant to be accessible. Someone who had decided, for reasons she didn't know and couldn't verify, that she should have this information, that someone was taking a risk or setting a trap. She couldn't rule out either. She closed the laptop, went to bed, did not sleep well. Monday morning, she was at the estate at 8, with the paper in her bag and a decision not yet fully made, but approaching completion the way decisions approached completion for her, not in a single moment of resolution, but through the gradual elimination of alternatives until only one remained. She did her work. She moved through the East Wing and then the service areas and then the second-floor corridor, and she did it with the same compact efficiency as always, and nobody looking at her would have seen anything different. At 10 a.m., she went to the staff room for her break and found Yoonji already there, coffee in hand, reviewing something on her tablet. They were alone. Marisol sat down. She thought for a moment. Then she said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be straight with me." Yoonji looked up from the tablet with the expression of a woman who had been waiting for this conversation for some time and had mixed feelings about its arrival. "Did you know?" Marisol said. "Before I was hired. Did you know how the position was filled?" Yoonji set the tablet face down on the table. She picked up her coffee cup and held it with both hands and didn't drink from it. "I process the placements as they come through the agency," she said. "I don't always know the full conversation behind a placement." "That's not what I asked." "No," Yoonji said. "It's not." Silence. "Yoonji?" "I had questions," Yoonji said finally, carefully, with the precision of a woman choosing each word from a limited supply. "When I saw the request criteria, I had questions about why the qualifications were so specific." She paused. "I asked. I was told the requirements were standard for the household security protocols. And you believed that." "I chose to believe it." She looked at Marisol directly for the first time in the conversation. "Those are different things. I know they're different things." Marisol looked at her. "Someone put an envelope in my message box Sunday," she said, "with a copy of an internal email." Yoonji's face did something careful and controlled. "I didn't put it there," she said. "I know," Marisol said. "If you'd wanted me to have something, you would have given it to me directly. That's who you are." Yoonji was quiet for a moment. "What are you going to do?" "I don't know yet." "If you go to him—" Yoonji stopped. "What?" "If you go to Mr. Kang with this, it changes everything. For everyone, not just for you." She set the coffee cup down. "I'm not telling you not to. I'm telling you to understand what it changes." Marisol understood. She'd understood since the bus ride home. She nodded and stood and went back to work. He came home Wednesday afternoon, a day earlier than the schedule had indicated. Marisol found out the way she found out most things in this house. Not by being told, but by the change in the household's atmosphere. The way the staff's movements became slightly more deliberate. The way Yoonji's posture adjusted by a few degrees when she came through the East Wing door. She was finishing the guest suite when she heard the main entrance, and she stood in the guest suite and thought about the paper in her bag and about timing, which was a thing she'd always been careful about. Timing was what separated a move from a mistake. She finished the guest suite, did the adjacent bathroom, stripped and remade the bed in the room at the end of the hall, carried the laundry to the service elevator and rode it down and transferred the laundry to the appropriate bin, and stood for a moment in the service corridor with her hands at her sides. Then she went to find him. He was in his study. The door was open by 6 inches, which she'd learned meant he was available for interruption if the interruption was worth it. She knocked on the door frame. He looked up from the desk. I need 10 minutes, she said. He looked at her face. Sit down, he said. She sat in the chair across from the desk. Clean lines, no upholstering, the kind of chair that was in the room for function rather than comfort, which was fine because she didn't want to be comfortable. And she opened her bag and took out the paper and unfolded it and placed it on the desk in front of him without saying anything. He looked at it. He read it. The room was very quiet. Through the window behind him, she could see the garden, the fog still low on the bay in the middle distance, the late afternoon light going gray. He finished reading, looked up at her. Where did you get this? It was in my message box Sunday. No name on the envelope. Have you shown it to anyone else? No. He looked back at this paper. His face was doing the closed, controlled thing it did when the machinery was running at full speed and he'd decided not to let any of it surface. I've photographed it, she said. Copies are stored. He looked up at her again. Something shifted slightly in his expression. Not quite surprise, but a reassessment. You're protecting yourself, he said. Yes. From me or from her? I don't know yet. He picked up the paper and read it again. She watched him do it and focused on keeping her breathing even, which required attention because the room and the moment and the man across the desk all combined into a pressure that wanted to express itself somewhere. She selected you, he said. It wasn't a question. That's how I read it. For the reasons listed. Yes. He set the paper down. He leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Not the gesture of a man who had nothing to say, but the gesture of a man deciding the order in which to say things. How long have you known something was wrong? He asked. Since the first schedule change, she said, but I didn't have a name for it until the Connolly call. And you stayed. I have a daughter, she said. Staying is what I do. The sentence came out without the careful editing she usually applied, and she felt it land in the room with more weight than she'd intended. She didn't take it back. It was true, and this seemed like the moment for true things. He was quiet for a long time. Then, I want you to go home tonight. I'll have Yoonji revise your schedule back to the original. Come in Thursday as usual. Bring Nova. She looked at him. It's not a discussion, he said. Not harshly, just with the flatness of a man used to the period at the end of his own sentences. Go home. She folded the paper and put it back in her bag and stood. Mr. Kang. He looked at her. Whoever sent me that envelope, she said. They took a risk. I want to understand why. He looked at her for a long moment. So do I, he said. She found out why at 7:43 that evening. She was at home, Nova in the bath, the apartment doing its small domestic sounds around her, when her phone rang. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. She answered. Ms. Reyes. A woman's voice, measured, accented slightly. Korean, she thought. My name is Park Soo-young. I work for Kim Domestic Staffing. Marisol sat down on the edge of the couch. Park Soo-young. The name from the email. The woman above Elena Park in the agency's hierarchy. The recipient of Vivian's request. I sent you the envelope, Park said. Why? A pause. Because I processed that request, and I have processed requests like it before, and I am tired of processing requests like it. Her voice was even, professionally controlled, with something underneath it that had been simmering for longer than this particular situation. And because Mr. Kang has been a client of this agency for 9 years, and what Miss Laurent did used our agency as a mechanism for something I don't believe he knew about. You sent it to protect the agency, Marisol said. I sent it because it was the right thing to do, Park said. The agency is also a consideration, but not the primary one. Marisol thought about this. Is there more, she asked, more than what was in the email? Another pause. Longer. There's a conversation I had with Miss Laurent 3 weeks ago, Park said. She called me. She asked about the process for terminating a domestic placement. Specifically, the documentation required if there were allegations of theft or misconduct. The room went very still around Marisol. She was asking about the termination process, she said. She was asking specifically about what the agency required if a household reported that an employee had stolen something. Park's voice was steady, careful, the voice of someone who had decided to say a thing and was saying it precisely. She asked about whether prior allegations, from a previous employer, for example, would affect the processing of a new complaint. Prior allegations. The Connollys. Marisol pressed the phone against her ear and breathed. She's going to report something missing, she said. I believe she's building a case, Park said. I don't know the timeline. I called you because I thought you should know before it happens rather than after. Why not go to Mr. Kong directly? I did, Park said. This morning. He was not available. And I thought... She paused. I thought you deserved to know first. You're the one with something to lose. After the call ended, Marisol sat on the edge of the couch for a long time. Nova called from the bath, and she called back that she was coming, and she sat for another 30 seconds doing nothing. Then she stood up and went to get her daughter out of the tub and wrapped her in a towel and held her longer than the situation required, her face pressed into Nova's damp hair, breathing. Mama, Nova said, muffled. Yeah, baby. You're squishing me. She loosened her arms. Sorry. Nova looked up at her with those enormous eyes, water on her eyelashes. Are you okay? The question, from a 4-year-old, with its complete unironic sincerity, hit somewhere that the rest of the evening hadn't quite reached. Yes, she said. I'm okay. She got Nova dried and dressed and fed and into bed, and she did all of it with the automatic competence of a mother whose body knows the routine even when her mind is somewhere else entirely. She read 2 pages of the book they were working through and turned off the light and came back to the kitchen and stood at the counter with her phone in her hand. She could call him tonight. She had his number. It had been given to all household staff for emergencies, a number that rang directly, not through an assistant. She could call and tell him what Park had said, and let him handle what came next, and the logic of that was sound because he was the one with the actual power in this situation, and she was a single mother with $200 in savings and a 4-year-old daughter and a job she was about to lose. She stood at the counter and felt the logic of it, and felt underneath the logic the bone-deep exhaustion of being someone who needed to be handled, of being the variable that required managing. She'd been someone else's variable before. She'd lived inside a life where her function was to be managed and contained, and she had gotten out of that life with her daughter, and not much else, and she had promised herself, not aloud, not in words, just in the quiet, specific way you promise yourself things when you're sitting in your car outside the place you're leaving for the last time, that she would not go back to being a variable. She put the phone down, picked it up, thought about Nova asleep in the next room, called him. It rang twice. Ms. Reyes. She's going to report something stolen, Marisol said. She's been building documentation, using the Connolly allegations as background. Park Soo-young called me tonight. She tried to reach you this morning. Silence on the line. The quality of it was not surprise silence. It was the silence of a man receiving confirmation of something he'd already been moving toward. How solid is the source? She sent me the envelope. She processed Vivian's original request. She has direct knowledge of a conversation 3 weeks ago where Vivian asked about termination procedures for theft allegations. She'll testify to that? She said she would. Another silence. Go to work Thursday, he said. As normal? If she moves before Thursday, she won't, he said. Not while I'm back in the house. She's too careful for that. A pause. You have the photographs of the document. Yes. Send them to this number, now, tonight. She sent them while they were still on the call. She heard the notification arrive on his end. Got them, he said. Mr. Kang. She stopped. What? When you confront her. She chose the word confronted deliberately. Confronted, not questioned. She's going to say this is about protecting the household, about my history with the Connollys. She's going to frame it that way. I know how she'll frame it. She's been in your life for 18 months. I've been in your house for 8 weeks. He was quiet. I know what the math looks like, she said. I'm telling you anyway. Why? Because you asked me an honest question 3 nights ago, and you told me it was worth something. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. I'm cashing that in. The silence on the line was different from the others. She couldn't characterize it exactly. She wasn't sure she wanted to. Thursday, he said. Thursday, she said. The call ended. She stood in the kitchen for a while longer. Then she went to check on Nova, asleep, still, one arm thrown over the edge of the bed the way she always slept, her small chest moving. Marisol stood in the doorway and watched her breathe and thought about Park Soo-young's voice on the phone. She's building a case. The thing about a built case was that it didn't require truth. It required documentation. Prior allegations, a pattern, a household employee with limited resources, and a reason to take things. That was a story that told itself. That was a story that, once told in the right room to the right people, didn't require refutation so much as it required erasure. And you couldn't erase a story once it was in circulation. You could only survive it or be consumed by it. She went back to the kitchen, looked at her phone, opened her contacts and found a name she hadn't called in 14 months. A woman named Diane Okafor, who was a paralegal at a small firm in the Mission District, who had helped her read the NDA and had said, at the time, "If you ever need anything, you call me." She'd never called. She called now. It rang 4 times. Then, "Marisol? I need to know what it takes to prove something didn't happen," Marisol said. "In writing, legally, before someone says it did." A pause. Then Diane, who had always been the kind of person who skipped the preamble when the preamble was a waste of time. "Tell me what you're dealing with," Marisol told her. She told her everything in the compressed, sequenced way she told things when she needed to be useful rather than expressive, and Diane listened and asked 3 questions and was quiet for a moment at the end. "Okay," Diane said. "Here's what you're going to do." Thursday came. Marisol arrived at 8, brought Nova, settled her in the music room as normal or as close to normal as anything felt, and went to her duties and moved through the house with the focused deliberateness of someone who is waiting for the other shoe and has decided to be standing properly when it falls. At 9:30, Yoonji found her in the second-floor corridor. "Ms. Laurent would like to see you," Yoonji said, "in the main sitting room." Marisol looked at her. "Now?" she said. "Now," Yoonji said, with the expression of a woman delivering news she would have preferred not to. The main sitting room was on the ground floor, west side, the room Marisol had cleaned 40-something times and entered perhaps twice for any other reason. It had tall windows and pale furniture and the specific curated stillness of a room that existed to impress people rather than to be used. She'd always thought it looked like a photograph of a room rather than an actual room. She walked into it now and felt it differently. Vivian was standing near the window. Not sitting, standing, which was a choice, the choice of someone who wanted the height advantage, the light behind her, the specific staging of a person who had arranged this scene in advance and placed herself in it with intention. She was in dark clothes today. Navy, not black, but close. Her hair was perfect. Her face was composed. On the low table between the sofas sat a small object. Marisol recognized it from 6 feet away and felt her stomach drop with the specific controlled plummet of someone who had been told to expect a fall and still finds the falling real. It was a watch. A man's watch, gold and heavy-looking, the kind of object that announced its own value without effort. She'd seen it before, on a shelf in the secondary study on the second floor, a room she cleaned weekly, a room where the watch had sat in a small dish with 2 other items, a pen and a cufflink, the kind of shelf arrangement that said these things were kept here but not worn, perhaps sentimental, perhaps simply displaced. She'd never touched it. She'd never touched anything in this house that wasn't directly part of her cleaning duties, a discipline she'd maintained with the deliberate precision of someone who understood that accusations didn't require evidence so much as they required plausibility. And plausibility in a house like this depended entirely on whether you'd given anyone a reason to point in your direction. She had not given anyone a reason. She looked at the watch, and then at Vivian, and kept her breathing even through an act of will that cost her something. "Close the door," Vivian said. Marisol reached back and pushed the door closed. She did not walk further into the room. She stayed near the door with her feet slightly apart on the pale carpet. "Do you know what that is?" Vivian asked. "It looks like a watch," Marisol said. "That was on the shelf in the secondary study." "It was on the shelf in the secondary study," Vivian said. "It was there Monday. It wasn't there this morning." "I cleaned that room Tuesday," Marisol said. "It was on the shelf when I finished." "Was it?" "Yes." Vivian moved slightly, just a shift of weight from one foot to the other, a small recalibration. "This was found this morning in the staff break room, in the cabinet beneath the sink, behind the cleaning supplies." The sentence landed in the room and sat there. Marisol looked at her. She looked at her and understood, with the cold clarity that had been building since Sunday evening, and the bus ride and the paper in her bag, and Diane Okafor's voice on the phone saying, "Here's what you're going to do." She understood that this moment had been constructed, not improvised. Constructed, with the watch placed in that cabinet at a time that could be attributed to her, in a location that connected to her break, and now delivered with Vivian standing in the light of the staged room presenting it as discovery.
I didn't put that there, Marisol said. The cabinet where the cleaning supplies are stored is part of your station, Vivian said. You're the primary user of that cabinet. I didn't put that there.
Vivian tilted her head slightly. The composed expression didn't crack, but something behind it sharpened. This is a watch that belonged to Taejun's father. It has significant sentimental and monetary value. Its presence in that cabinet, behind materials used exclusively by household cleaning staff. I didn't take it, Marisol said. Her voice was level. She was making it level through the same kind of effort that was keeping her hands still at her sides. And you know I didn't take it. A silence. Vivian looked at her. Something in the look acknowledged the statement. Not its truth, but its directness. The fact that Marisol had named the thing between them without dressing it up, and then moved past it. I think we should wait for Taejun, Vivian said. He should hear this directly. Yes, Marisol said. He should. Vivian's expression shifted by a fraction. She'd expected something else. Deflection or distress, or the specific collapse of someone who understands they've been cornered and doesn't know the corner was anticipated. Marisol stood at the door and breathed and thought about the photographs on her phone and the call to Diane and the 3 things Diane had told her to do and had confirmed by text at 11 p.m. that she'd done. She thought about the recording app Diane had told her to activate before entering any conversation related to this matter. She'd activated it in the hallway. It was running now, in her apron pocket. Sit down, Vivian said. I'm fine standing. Another fractional shift. Marisol, Miss Laurent, Marisol said, and the correction was deliberate, a line drawn, the same line Vivian had been drawing for 8 weeks in the other direction. I'll stand, Tutsats. Taejun arrived in 4 minutes. She heard him on the stairs before the door opened, his particular footfall, which she'd catalogued without meaning to over 8 weeks the way you catalogue the sounds of places you spent time in. He came through the door and took in the room in 2 seconds. Vivian near the window, the watch on the table. Marisol at the door. His face did its closed, controlled thing and he walked into the room and stopped between them. He looked at the watch, then at Vivian. Tell me, he said. Vivian told him. She told it well. She was good at this. Marisol had to give her that. The voice calibrated to concern rather than accusation. The framing built around the watch's significance and the location where it had been found, with Marisol's exclusive use of that cabinet established as context rather than conclusion. She left room for doubt. She presented it as a situation requiring clarity rather than a verdict already reached. It was a good performance. Taejun listened to it without interrupting. When she finished, he stood for a moment looking at the watch on the table. Then he looked at Marisol. Your response, he said. I didn't take it, Marisol said. I cleaned that study Tuesday. The watch was on the shelf. I finished the room at approximately 10:20, logged it in the cleaning record, and moved to the west corridor. I haven't been in that study since. The break room cabinet, he said. I used it Monday for supply inventory, not since then. Who else has access to it? Any member of the household staff. He turned back to Vivian. When did you find it? This morning. I asked Yoonji to do an inventory of the break room supplies. We've had some discrepancy in the ordering. You asked Yoonji to inventory the break room this morning, Taejun said. The sentence was flat, without inflection. On a Thursday. That's not a standard inventory day. A beat. I noticed the discrepancy yesterday, Vivian said. Yesterday you were in Moran, he said. You had lunch with Celeste Bouchard and came back at 6. I have it in my calendar because I was supposed to join you. Another beat, smaller, tighter. I called Yoonji from Maran, Vivian said. When I noticed the... I'll talk to Yoonji, he said. The room changed when he said it. Not loudly, not with any particular force, just 3 words, with the weight of a man who had run the numbers and reached a preliminary result and was now moving to confirm it. Vivian felt it. Marisol watched her feel it, the slight change in her posture, the recalibration happening behind her eyes. Tai, I said I'll talk to Yoonji. He looked at Marisol. Go to your duties. Stay in the house. Wait, Vivian said. He looked at her. She has a history, Vivian said. The warmth was leaving her voice now, not all at once, but steadily, like heat leaving a room when the source is cut. The Connolly family. I know about the Connolly family, he said. A silence. I know about the call you made to Park Soo-young at the agency, he said. 3 weeks ago. I know what you asked her. The room went very still. Vivienne looked at him. Something in her face was working through a rapid, invisible recalculation, the kind you could see in the set of someone's jaw and the slight change in their breathing and the specific way their eyes stopped moving. I'm trying to protect this household, she said. No, he said. One word. Clean. He walked out of the sitting room. Vivienne stood at this window, and her face, in the moment she thought she was unobserved, did something that Marisol was close enough to see. It didn't crumble. Vivienne Laurent was not a woman who crumbled, but the architecture of it shifted, the careful constructed surface admitting for one unguarded second the thing underneath, which was not grief and not guilt, but the cold, hard recognition of a plan encountering an obstacle it had not fully modeled. Then she turned and found Marisol still in the room. They looked at each other. You should know, Vivienne said, and her voice was different now, stripped of the calibration, something raw and more honest underneath it, that this isn't over because he walked out of a room. I know, Marisol said. He'll come back to me. He always does. Men like him. She stopped, started differently. I have 18 months in this house. In his life. You've been here 8 weeks.
I know that too, Marisol said. Then why are you still standing here? It wasn't a question. It was something else, genuine almost, underneath the threat. Something that might have been, in a different architecture, curiosity. Marisol thought about Nova in the music room 3 floors away, feet swinging above the pedals, finding the notes she was looking for. Because someone has to, she said. She left the sitting room. Then.
The next 2 hours were the longest of her time in this house. She worked. She did it because standing still was not an option her body could manage, and because work had always been the container she put things in when they had nowhere else to go. She moved through the West Wing with her cart and her supplies, and her hands performing the familiar motions, and her mind running the scenarios in a tight, controlled loop, the recording in her pocket. She'd gotten the confrontation. Vivienne's words about the cabinet, about exclusive access, enough to establish the frame, enough for Diane to work with, the photographs of the email, already with Diane, and already, per their conversation, structured into a formal declaration that had been dated and witnessed electronically the previous night. The cleaning log from Tuesday, with her signature and timestamp on the secondary study. Physical record, already photographed and sent. It was not a fortress, but it was walls. And walls were what you built when the alternative was standing in the open. She was in the east corridor at noon when Yoonji appeared. He wants to see you, Yoonji said. Study, now. Marisol put down what she was holding and went. Torosham, he was standing when she entered. Not behind the desk, beside it, which was different, the way he stood when he was working something out on his feet rather than sitting with it. He had a phone in one hand but wasn't using it. The window behind him showed the bay, the fog mostly gone now, the water gray-green and flat. Close the door, he said. She closed it. Yoonji didn't make that call, he said. The call to inventory the break room. I know. Vivienne placed it from her own phone from the car at 7:15 this morning, before she came downstairs. He looked at the phone in his hand and then set it on the desk. She put the watch in the cabinet herself, either last night or early this morning, before the rest of the house was awake. Marisol said nothing. I had the security footage from the break room corridor reviewed, he said. She was in that corridor at 6:48 a.m. The timestamp is clean. Will you confront her with that? I already have, he'd said. She looked at him. 40 minutes ago, he said. In the bedroom. I showed her the timestamp. He paused. She didn't deny it. The sentence sat in the air between them. She didn't deny it, Marisol said slowly. She said she did what she had to do, to protect what she'd built. He said it without emotion, which was its own kind of emotion, the kind that had been processed somewhere before it arrived in the voice. Those were her words. Marisol thought about Vivienne at the window that morning, the rawness in her voice when she'd dropped the calibration, what she'd built, 18 months, the architecture of a life she'd decided she was owed. What happens now? Marisol asked. He looked at her with the directness that she'd stopped finding startling over the past several weeks and had started finding something else. She didn't examine what something else meant. Not now. I need you to understand something, he said. What I'm going to do next will affect your position here. It will create disruption in this household that will be visible and significant. I can handle disruption, she said. It may also create exposure for you, he said. If she decides to push the Connolly angle publicly, through legal means or through the social network she spent 18 months building in this city, she can try, Marisol said. I have documentation that predates any claim she makes. I have a recording of this morning's conversation. I have a paralegal who filed a protective declaration last night. She paused. I'm not the one without walls. He looked at her for a long moment. Then something happened to his expression that she'd seen once before, the night Nova played. That involuntary opening, the thing that happened when the performance machinery ran out of material and the actual man appeared in the gap. When did you do all that? He asked. Sunday night, she said, after the call from Park Soo-young. He was quiet. You were 2 days ahead of this, he said. I have a daughter, she said. I stopped being 2 steps behind things when she was born. He nodded once, slowly, and picked up his phone again and looked at it and made a decision that she could see forming in the specific way his jaw set and his shoulders came back a fraction. I need an hour, he said. Go be with Nova. She went. She found Nova in the music room, exactly where she'd left her, so absorbed in what she was doing that she hadn't noticed the time, the hunger she was certainly feeling, or the fact that the light in the room had shifted fully into afternoon. Marisol sat on the small bench against the wall, the one she'd claimed over the past weeks as her watching spot, and listened. Nova was playing something new, or rather something she'd been building for the past week that was arriving now in something closer to a complete form, a longer piece, more complex than the melody from the dinner, with a beginning and a middle and something that might be an ending still being worked out. It moved differently from the first piece. The first piece had been instinctive, a child finding sound. This was something more deliberate, a child starting to understand the relationship between intention and result. Marisol sat and listened and let herself feel, for the first time since Sunday, something that didn't have a name in the vocabulary of crisis management, something quieter, something that lived in the sound her daughter was making and the afternoon light on the pale wood panels and the brief, extraordinary reprieve of a moment that was only itself. It lasted 6 minutes. Then the door opened. She looked up. Tae-jun stood in the doorway. He looked at Nova first, then at Marisol. Nova stopped playing and turned around and looked at him with those enormous unfiltered eyes. Did I interrupt? He asked her. I'm not done yet, Nova said. Then I'll wait, he said. He came into the room and stood near the door, hands in his pockets, and Nova turned back to the piano with the complete unself-consciousness of a child who has accepted that some adults say they'll wait and actually mean it, and began to play again. Marisol looked at him. He was looking at Nova, but after a moment he felt her looking and met her eyes and held them. She looked at his face and read what was there. Not the controlled surface, not the machinery. The actual thing underneath, which she had seen in pieces over 8 weeks and was now visible in one place, assembled. A man who had spent a long time building walls for legitimate reasons, and was standing in a room where a 4-year-old kept finding the notes that made walls beside the point. He didn't say anything. She didn't either. Nova played. And then from downstairs came the sound of a door. The main entrance. Hard, the way it sounded when someone left without consideration for the people inside. And the house absorbed the sound and went quiet, and the quiet told them both something that didn't need to be said. Tae-jun's hands in his pockets closed slowly into fists. He looked at Marisol. She looked back at him. Between them, in the space that the music had been filling, and was now filling again as Nova found her way back to the melody she'd been building, something shifted that, between them, in the space that the music had been filling and was now filling again as Nova found her way back to the melody she'd been building, something shifted that had no clean name and didn't need one. Tae-jun looked away first. He pulled his hands from his pockets and walked to the window and stood with his back to the room, looking out at the garden where the afternoon light had gone the color of old brass, and Marisol watched him and understood that the sound of that door, the main entrance, hard, final, was still moving through him the way sound moves through a structure after the source has stopped. He stood there for a long moment. Nova played. She was working the ending of the piece, the part still being resolved, and she kept coming back to the same sequence and adjusting it by one note, listening, adjusting again. There was something almost methodical about it, a 4-year-old doing what musicians spent decades learning to do. sitting with the unfinished thing until it told you what it needed. Taejun turned from the window. "I need to make a call," he said. To Marisol, not to Nova. Though Nova glanced up briefly with the acknowledgement of someone noting that adults were doing adult things in the background and resuming her actual work. "Stay in the house today, both of you." "Are we in a difficult position?" Marisol asked. He looked at her steadily. "No," he said. "You're not." He left. Marisol sat with the word "you" for a moment. The distinction it made, specific and deliberate, the kind of thing a careful man said when he meant to separate one situation from another. She got up and went to the piano bench and sat beside Nova on the far end of it, the way she sometimes did. Nova didn't look up, but leaned slightly in her direction, the unconscious animal comfort of a child who knows her person is close. "How's the ending?" Marisol asked. "It's almost there," Nova said. "I can hear it. I just can't find it yet." "You'll find it," Marisol said. "I know," Nova said. Not with arrogance, just with the calm certainty of someone who has learned that the thing she's looking for doesn't hide from her permanently. It's there. She just hasn't reached it yet. Marisol put her arm around her daughter and looked at the keys and thought about endings and didn't say anything else. Vivienne was gone by the time the evening came. Not dramatically. Not in the way that the last several weeks had suggested she might leave. In a confrontation, in accusations and counter-accusations, with legal instruments and witnesses and the particular wreckage of a public falling apart. She was gone the way she'd constructed everything else. Efficiently, invisibly, through channels and mechanisms that produced the outcome without the exposure. By 5 p.m., 3 of her staff, 2 personal assistants and a driver, who answered to her rather than the household, had removed 12 bags and 4 boxes from the estate's secondary storage room. By 6 p.m., the bedroom she'd shared with Taejun had been relieved of the things that were specifically hers, the careful personalization she'd installed over 18 months. By the time Marisol was helping Nova with dinner in the kitchen, the main suite smelled like the cedar from the closet where Vivienne's clothes had hung and nothing else. Yoonji, who managed these things, managed this one with the same steady competence she brought to everything, and if she felt anything about it, she kept it in the same place she kept everything. Taejun ate dinner in his study. Marisol put Nova to bed in the small guest room on the second floor that Yoonji had quietly prepared without being asked, and she sat on the edge of the narrow bed and watched Nova fall asleep with the speed of children who have used everything they had that day and have nothing left to negotiate with. 1 minute awake, the next not. Just gone into sleep like stepping off a curb. She sat in the dim room for a while after. Then she went back downstairs. She found him in the kitchen. He was at the counter with a glass of water and his phone face down beside it, not doing anything in particular. Just standing in the kitchen, the way people stand in kitchens late at night when the day has been the kind that leaves you needing to be somewhere simple. He looked up when she came in. She went to the refrigerator and took out the container of rice and leftover vegetables that someone, probably Yoonji, probably acting on institutional care rather than specific instruction, had left for the evening. She put it in a pan without ceremony and put the pan on the stove and adjusted the heat. He watched her do it. "You don't have to," he started. "You didn't eat," she said. He closed his mouth. She stirred the rice and didn't look at him and let the kitchen sounds. The soft percussion of the spoon on the pan, the low breath of the gas flame, the settling of the house around them at this hour, fill the space between them without either of them doing anything about it. She put the food in a bowl and set it on the counter in front of him and then put the pan in the sink and ran water over it. He looked at the bowl. "Sit down," she said. He sat. She took the stool across from him, the same configuration as the breakfast conversation months ago, except that everything between that morning and this one had happened and was now in the room with them, taking up space. He ate. She watched him and didn't watch him, and the kitchen held them both. After a while, he said, "She called her attorney this afternoon." "I know," Marisol said. "Diane called me. There won't be any formal action. You're paralegal." She filed the protective declaration Monday night. When Vivienne's attorney reviewed the documentation, the email, the recording, the security timestamp from the break room corridor, they advised her that proceeding would produce exposure she couldn't afford. Marisol paused. She has her own reputation to protect. That matters more to her than making the claim. He looked at her. "You had all of that ready," he said. "Yes." Before I knew what she was building. Yes. He was quiet for a moment, working through something. The envelope, he said. From Park Soo-young. If you hadn't received it, I would have figured it out, Marisol said. Maybe not in time, but I would have. He nodded slowly. He looked at the bowl in front of him and then back at her. Tell me about the Connollys, he said. All of it. Not the version you gave me before. She considered this for a moment. The kitchen was quiet around them, the city outside doing its distant nighttime things, the estate sealed and warm around the two of them, and a sleeping child upstairs. Mrs. Connolly's jewelry box went missing, she said. A sapphire bracelet. She said she'd seen me near the room where she kept it. I had been near the room. I cleaned it every week. It was part of my duties. But I hadn't touched the jewelry box. She paused. The bracelet turned up 3 months later, at a consignment shop, sold by Mrs. Connolly's daughter, who had a problem that required the kind of money you got from selling sapphire bracelets to consignment shops. He was very still. Mrs. Connolly knew, Marisol said. Once the bracelet was found, she knew it wasn't me. She didn't say it directly. What she did was send me a check for 2 months' additional salary and write the reference letter herself rather than leaving it to her husband. Marisol looked at her own hands on the counter. That was her version of an apology. I took it because I had Nova to feed and a lease coming up. You didn't fight it at the time, he said. No. But you kept the documentation. I keep documentation, she said. I've kept documentation since I was 22 years old, and my ex-husband told me one story and did another, and I didn't have anything in writing. She looked up at him. I learned. He was looking at her with the full weight of his attention, which was a heavy thing to be under, and which she'd grown over the past weeks to find bearable in the way that you find things bearable when you've accepted them as real. Your husband, he said, and let it be a question or not a question, open for her to take or leave. She took it. We were together for 5 years, married for 3. He left when Nova was 7 months old. He didn't leave dramatically. He just stopped coming back, the way water drains gradually, until you look up one day and the container is empty. She said it without particular emotion, the flat delivery of something that had been processed to its terminal point. He lives in Phoenix now. He's sent $700 in child support over 4 years. Does Nova ask about him? She will, Marisol said. She doesn't have the words for it yet, but she's starting to notice the shape of his absence. She paused. I'm trying to figure out what to say when she does. He set down his spoon. Tell her the truth, he said. The version she can carry, not all of it at once. He looked at something past her shoulder for a moment. That's what my mother did. My father was not... He stopped, rerouted. He was not present in the ways that mattered. She told me what was true without telling me what would break something. And when I was old enough to know the rest, she told me that too. Marisol looked at him. In 8 weeks, she had gathered pieces of this man, the way you gathered pieces of anything you had to understand in order to survive proximity to it. The control, the discipline, the specific kind of loneliness that accrued to people who had learned early that other people were liabilities if you let them in too close. She'd assumed the loneliness was incidental to who he was. She was beginning to think it was the thing he'd built everything else around, the structure that protected the part of him that could still be damaged. Was she right? Marisol asked. Your mother. Did it help to know the truth in stages? He thought about this with the seriousness he brought to actual questions. It helped me understand him, he said. It didn't help me miss him less. He picked up his water glass. But that was going to be true regardless. They sat with that for a moment. Nova's going to be fine, he said. It didn't come out like reassurance. It came out like a thing he'd looked at and assessed and arrived at as a conclusion. I know, Marisol said. I mean specifically, he said. I'd like to arrange for lessons, formal ones. I mentioned it at the dinner. You mentioned it publicly, she said. To 40 people. Before you'd mentioned it to me, he stopped. Yes, he said. I did. That was, she started. I know what it was, he said. It was not the right order of things. He looked at her directly. I'd like to ask you properly. If Nova is willing, and if you're willing, I'd like to arrange for her to study with someone qualified, not as a spectacle, not as a statement, as an investment in something real. Marisol looked at him for a long time. Why? She asked. The question landed between them, and he didn't flinch from it. Because I heard her play, he said. And something in the room changed, including something in me. And I have spent a long time not doing anything about the things that change something in me. He said it evenly, without drama, the flatness of a man reporting an observed fact. I'm tired of that. She looked at her hands on the counter, then at him. We'll ask Nova, she said. Yes, he said. We'll ask Nova. They asked Nova in the morning. Nova was at the breakfast counter in her octopus shirt, eating toast with the focused attention she gave to things she considered worthwhile, when Tae-jun sat down across from her and said, "How would you feel about having a piano teacher?" Nova looked up. She thought about it with the seriousness of a child who understood that some questions required actual consideration. "A real one?" she asked. "A real one," he said. "Someone whose job is to help you find more notes." Nova considered this. Would I still get to make up my own? That would be the point, he said. She looked at him with those enormous eyes, the full, unfiltered assessment. Okay, she said. She went back to her toast. Marisol, standing at the counter with her coffee, watched this exchange and felt something move through her chest that was too large for the moment, and also exactly right for it. Dr. Hana Seo came to the estate for the first time on a Thursday morning 3 weeks later. She was a small Korean-American woman in her 50s with short gray hair and hands that looked like they'd been playing piano since before most people in the room had been born, which was true. She came in through the main entrance, which was itself a statement of the thing that had quietly reorganized over the previous weeks without announcement, the slow, unmarked shift in what this house was and who moved through it and in what capacity. She spent 30 minutes with Nova before she said anything to either adult in the room. She sat beside Nova on the bench and listened and asked questions and listened more, and Nova answered the questions with the specific lack of self-consciousness she brought to things she loved, and Dr. Seo watched her hands and her face and the way she tilted her head when she was listening to what she'd just played. Then she stood up and turned to Tae-jun and Marisol, who had been sitting on the bench against the wall in the same configuration Marisol had occupied for the past weeks. She hears the relationships between notes, Dr. Seo said. That's not something you teach. She already has it. What she needs is the framework, theory, technique, vocabulary, to build around what she already knows. She paused. This is going to take years, and it's going to be worth every one of them. Nova, at the piano, played 4 notes in a row and then changed the last one and played them again. Already working. The weeks after that had a different texture than the weeks before. The household reorganized around its true shape, the shape it had actually been moving towards since the morning a 4-year-old had wandered into a music room and put her hands on keys she'd never touched and found something that was already hers. Yoon-ji, who had navigated the previous months with the careful neutrality of someone walking a wire, allowed herself to be simply competent and direct, which was her natural state in which the household functioned better inside. The staff, freed from the particular atmospheric pressure of Vivian's managed presence, moved through their duties without the low-grade vigilance that had been the room tone for over a year. Tae-jun's professional life continued as it had always continued, with its specific demands and its moral weight and its accumulated consequences, none of which disappeared because his personal life had shifted. He went to meetings that could not be in any record. He made decisions that required the part of him built for hard things. He came home at the end of those days and stood in the kitchen or the garden or the corridor outside the music room and let the sound of Nova practicing move through the walls to wherever he was standing, and something in the architecture of his daily pressure adjusted slightly. It was not nothing. It was not yet everything. It was the beginning of a direction. Marisol continued her work. She was honest with herself about what she was and wasn't, what she wanted and didn't want, what the situation was and wasn't. She was an employee in a household that had changed around her through circumstances she'd partly survived and partly engineered, and the man who owned the household was someone she'd come to know in the specific compressed way you came to know people when the situation removed the usual layers of performance and left only the real thing. That was not the same as knowing what came next. She called Diane Okafor twice in those weeks. Once to formally close the protective declaration, which was no longer needed. Once for a different reason that wasn't legal, that she acknowledged she was calling a paralegal to have instead of someone else. And Diane told her with the directness that had always been her best quality. Marisol, what you're actually asking me is whether it's okay to trust someone again. I can't answer that. No documentation in the world can answer that. She'd known that. She'd called anyway because sometimes you needed to hear the thing you already knew said by someone outside your own head. She kept working. She enrolled in an online course, Music Education Fundamentals, offered through a state university extension program. 8 weeks, $20 a week. She didn't easily have, but reorganized her budget to produce. She sat at her kitchen table on Tuesday evenings while Nova slept and worked through the coursework with the same deliberate, methodical attention she brought to everything that mattered, and found that the material connected to things she'd been absorbing for months without knowing she was absorbing them. The hours in the music room, the conversations with Dr. Seo, the particular education of sitting beside someone who was learning something real. She didn't tell Taejun about the course for 3 weeks. When she did, it came out sideways, in the middle of a different conversation about Nova's progress, and he looked at her and said, "How long have you been doing this?" 3 weeks, she said. "What program?" She told him. He was quiet for a moment. "There's a better one," he said. Not dismissively, evaluatively, the way he assessed everything. A partnership program through the conservatory. They place participants in classroom settings while they complete the credential. "It's probably expensive," she said. "Probably," he said. He didn't say anything else about that. He didn't have to. She thought about what Diane had said. She thought about Nova, who trusted without analyzing the trust because she was 4 years old and had not yet learned to confuse caution with wisdom. "Tell me about the program," she said. He told her. Bacham. The evening Nova finished her first complete composition was a Saturday in autumn. Dr. Seo had given her the assignment 3 weeks before. Take what you've been building and bring it to an end. A real end, not just stopping. An ending that knew what it was. Nova had worked on it every day. She'd worked on it with the contained intensity she brought to things she was serious about, which was most things, which was one of the qualities that Dr. Seo had told Marisol quietly one afternoon was rare in a child this age. Not the talent, which was evident, but the willingness to sit with the unfinished thing and not force it to be done before it was ready. That Saturday, Nova called them into the music room. She called them both. She stood at the door and found them in the kitchen where they'd been sitting over coffee in the late afternoon, Marisol with the conservatory program materials spread on the counter, Taejun with his phone he'd put down 20 minutes ago and not picked back up, and Nova stood in the kitchen doorway in her socks and her octopus shirt. The shirt was getting small now, the hem rising. She was growing. She was always growing. And she said, "I'm ready. Come listen." They came. They sat on the bench against the wall, the bench that had become, over these months, the specific place in this house where the usual agreements about space and distance had quietly dissolved. They sat, and Nova climbed onto the piano bench and put her small hands on the keys and turned around once to look at them. She looked at her mother first. Marisol nodded. She looked at Taejun. He nodded. She turned back to the piano. She played. The piece was 3 minutes and 40 seconds long. Marisol would know this later, when Dr. Seo timed it at the following Thursday lesson and wrote it in her notes. In the moment, it had no duration. It had only itself, a thing that began with the careful questioning notes Nova had been working on since the morning she'd first sat down at this instrument, that gathered itself through the middle into something fuller and more complex than anything she'd produced before. And that resolved at the end with the 4 notes she'd been adjusting for weeks. The 4 notes that turned out to be not an ending so much as an arrival. The sense of coming to the place you'd been moving toward without knowing it was there. When it was done, Nova sat very still. The room held the sound the way the room had always held sound. Those pale wood panels, the high ceiling, the afternoon light now going amber through the south windows. Then Nova turned around. She looked at them both. "Good," she said. Not a question, not a performance of confidence. Just the clear, calm report of a person who had set out to find something and found it and was telling you so. Marisol laughed. It came out sudden and real, the kind of laugh that arrives from somewhere below the chest, and her eyes went wet without her entirely deciding they would, and she pressed her fingers briefly against her mouth and took a breath. "Yeah, baby," she said. "Good." She looked at Taejun. He was looking at Nova. His face was doing the thing it did in unguarded moments, open, without the professional surface, the actual man visible in the space where the performance had stopped. He looked at this small girl on her piano bench in her octopus shirt, and his expression held something that had no single name, that was assembled from things he'd spent a long time keeping in separate rooms and was now, in this moment, allowing to exist together. He looked at Marisol. She looked back at him. There was no roadmap for what they were and what they might become. There was no contract and no agreement and no clean language that covered the territory of two people who had survived proximity to each other's real selves and found the real selves worth continuing toward. There was only this: a music room in the late afternoon, a child who had found her ending, and the beginning of something that had been arriving since the morning it started, quiet and unhurried, the way the most durable things always arrived. "Play it again," he said to Nova. Nova turned back to the piano. She played it again. Outside, the fog had come back in off the bay, soft and low, moving across the hills the way it always did at this hour, indifferent to everything beneath it. The gates of the estate stood as they always stood. The security cameras ran their quiet rotations. The city below went on being the city. Inside the music room, a 4-year-old played the piece she'd made herself, for the second time, with two people listening who had found their way to this bench through everything it had cost them to be honest, in a world that rewarded the opposite. Nova's feet swung above the pedals. Her hands moved across the keys. The music filled the room and the room held it, and outside the bay went gray-green in the fading light, and the fog moved in, and nothing about the world had gotten simpler, and nothing about the future was guaranteed, and the three of them were together in the amber light of late afternoon, and the piece was almost done, and Nova's fingers were already finding the 4 final notes, and the room was already leaning toward the place where the sound would live for a moment, before the silence took it, and then the last note, clear, certain, gone. And in the quiet after it, Nova turned around and looked at them both, and whatever she saw in their faces satisfied her completely, because she nodded once, with the gravity of someone closing an account that has been properly settled, and climbed down from the bench. "Okay," she said. "Now I'm hungry." Marisol laughed again. Taejun made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was in the same family, something that came from a part of him that hadn't been used in a long time and was finding its way back. Nova walked between them toward the door, and they stood and followed her, and the music room went quiet behind them, the Steinway patient in the early dark, waiting for tomorrow.